Yes, hello and welcome to the third edition of the Bass Wave podcast. I'm your host, the DJ Romantic. This is a Bass Wave where we go east to west and back again, looking at international lifestyle opportunities, global possibilities, of course, on a bed of silky smooth bass sounds. Right now, of course, COVID is the answer to how every aspect we usually look at here has developed. So what we can do is start from that point that COVID presents us with and then look at how that may change the way we are approaching these solutions that we've looked at in the previous episodes of Bass Wave. That's right. It's about music and culture, lifestyle, sustainability, businesses, and even adventure and romance. That's right, internationally. So when we first kicked off the Bass Wave podcast, what we were talking about was the Western lifestyle that many of us have got used to in the big Western cities, and aspects of that lifestyle that we were slowly becoming aware were just not sustainable. And this year, 2020, was the year things really broke. And I look at what I was saying in that first podcast, and it is all just amazing how much it rings true, even though in that situation I was just talking about smaller details, like the costs of accommodation we're facing in the Western cities, and the traffic, and just the cost of living. So the Bass Wave podcast was all about taking the best of both worlds, looking at the East and West, and how that could provide lifestyle solutions that could be sustainable and beneficial to you, to adopting a new kind of way of living. And so in the first episode, it was very broad. We ranged over a number of topics about how we were living in the West and how people live in the East and Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, in those areas where I was traveling and began to travel each year. And in the second episode, I more followed my personal progress as I traveled through various cities that I had visited previously, tried new cities, and showed people the basics of the cost of living and the way that you could maximize your lifestyle by living in places that were much cheaper, and how you could basically de-stress, leave less of a footprint, live a more minimalistic lifestyle, really. So it really does depend on aspects of your lifestyle, of course, but if you are a cultural person or an artist, then you're not going to just be attracted to Eastern Europe and to Southeast Asia and these types of places because you have a more affordable lifestyle there. But there's so much culture and a scene going on at scale that you can still participate, even though your cost of living has dramatically dropped. You're getting access to top facilities, to top galleries, to top performances, and this is obviously not just attractive for people who are in the arts or developing their talents or skills, but anyone wanting a variety of experiences in life. Need I say, the food, the atmosphere, the history, the proximity to other parts of Europe and Asia that are also worth exploring. But before we even get talking about COVID while we're reviewing some of the topics that were discussed in the previous episodes, we've got to still talk about sustainability sustainability, and that really does come back to your footprint and how much income that you need to earn to support your lifestyle, let alone the small details like, of course, in these Eastern European cities, in these Southeastern Asian cities, you've got access to proper public transport and you don't need to rely on a vehicle. It's possible to minimize your lifestyle in that way, to just eating locally through small businesses and such. But this is, of course, where we need to zoom out and look at the situation globally, that you are most effective in implementing and networking around local solutions, but at the global level, what needs to happen is that everybody in the West needs to bring their lifestyles down to the level of what people are already living at in Eastern Europe and in Southeast Asia. That presents the global solution. So by living at that level of consumption, you are already adjusting your consumption to the level that is going to be required for the world to keep going the way it is. The problem mainly lies with the middle class in the West, that they will not stop their habits of consumption. But once you move to Eastern Europe and are living at that level of consumption, you're no longer putting the same pressure on the world's resources that require you to go to be part of the machine, part of the corporations that are out there causing all the damage in the world. You see, the cities I'm talking about, you can live a pretty reasonable life with your own apartment and restaurant meals and public transport and everything you need for $1,000 US a month. So that, of course, means that you don't have to take the same types of employment if you can get remote work or some kind of creative work that you can do while you're overseas. So here we see themes that I took up in earlier podcasts about lowering your footprint, lowering your cost of living, living a more localized lifestyle, therefore needing to earn less and not requiring that you engage with aspects of capitalism that you don't agree with, and how this can help you recreate the balance and reinforce and model a more sustainable set of behaviors. Oh yes, but this was before COVID even came along, and I discovered so many aspects of sustainability I'd be talking about were actually all about resilience and anti-fragility, robustness, being prepared for whatever challenges could arise. Having this perspective prepared me with ideas that meant I was already well positioned when this whole COVID thing took off. And I'm now able to reflect on how ideas about how work from home and relocating out of Western cities to improve your lifestyle and cost of living and general footprint on the environment, all these ideas are only more relevant with COVID, but with a whole new set of challenges specific to COVID, which of course centers around what travel and immigration situations may present themselves. Huge amounts of uncertainty, which made it hard to complete this podcast as I got deeper into this problem. As COVID got more intense about just how long and how severely travel and immigration would be affected, and how that changes the whole perspective I'm taking to provide the most relevant information about international lifestyles, Eastern European lifestyles, you know. So I saw other guys who do more regular travel and lifestyle content struggling because they were forced to act as if everything was going to go back to normal soon, because this is their livelihoods that depends on it. And it became clearer and clearer that this was not going to be the case. And it's this episode of Basewave that each episode we get a new approach into dense cross-sections of ideas surrounding globalization and how we personally can stand to benefit from globalization trends. But now we see a virus, and that is the complete anathema to globalization. A pandemic shutting down travel, trade, entertainment, public spaces, business, sociality, group interaction. So we have no choice but to open up to the uncertainty of the situation and the risks and threats we can recognize and plan accordingly. Because Western systems have been proven, as I pointed out, to be shaky, vulnerable, overstressed by profit-driven motives, extractive approaches. So we honestly confront the uncertain future, but also look at some of the dynamics in play that are now unavoidable. Because this is a lifestyle podcast, and political matters are supposed to be incidental aspects, of navigating, living a life between the East and West. But more and more geopolitical and political considerations began to arise that are more than issues of current affairs. They are this important background to how you make decisions about the uncertainty that is confronting us. I had already begun recording the podcast when the Belarus elections broke out in protests, and this was then followed by elections here in New Zealand and then of course in the US, and all of these threw up so many uncertainties that it was important to see the results play out and get some kind of understanding. In the first episode I did say the political and cultural conflicts and heated debate right now are only evidence of deeply unresolved issues, conflicts. All we need to understand is the risks and opportunities that exist without holding any fixed perspective about race issues, immigration issues, dating issues, gender issues, and what travel and COVID mean in those contexts. More than ever, we need to take away from debates only what we need to change our behaviour to our own benefit, because we need to be responsive to solutions that are presenting themselves. In the lead up to the US election, of course, we have Hunter Biden's involvement in various Ukraine-based corruption scams, and that reflects the same scandals that were pushed on the other side of the American politics regarding Russiagate, and that Donald Trump was somehow involved in corrupt practices, misinformation within Russia, and in the end I had to reflect on that in terms of my perspective here on the podcast, that personally I believe both scandals are sure to have some aspect of truth to them. And what this represents in terms of ideas you and I can actually take away is that huge opportunities exist in Eastern Europe, and they exist in New Zealand and Canada, but for a whole different set of reasons. And this is important in terms of levelling up your thinking. Both Eastern Europe and the remote extremes of the British colonies require much development, and so this creates huge opportunity. And this is exactly what the Base Wave podcast is all about. It's about seeing the different opportunities that exist where things are developing, recognizing where you can leverage that. In New Zealand, Canada, Australia, you have natural resources, vast space, land, ocean. This represents opportunity in that there's huge room for progress and development within the physical material environment, and strategic isolation from destabilizing conflicts, whereas in Eastern Europe it's about conflicts and cultural and systemic structures that have prevented aspects of modernization occurring. And this creates a whole different kind of opportunities for Westerners coming into that situation, where in the West, modernization has created adverse effects for certain parts of the population. In some of my favorite cheap cities with a great vibe, such as Tbilisi or Belgrade, new modern apartments are being built when, like nearly every city in Eastern Europe, the population is still lower now than it was at its peak before the fall of the Iron Curtain. Romania and Ukraine have experienced massive exodus. Millions of people have left in the last couple of decades. In Serbia, of course, as with Ukraine, there was an actual military conflict. What this means is an area that has been economically depressed and destabilized is now recovering. But there is not the same issue with housing in these cities as in the West, as this is the cornerstone of your dramatically lower cost of living in Eastern Europe. In most of these cities, there simply isn't the population pressure for housing inflation to occur. There will remain cheap apartments in great, vibrant cities in Eastern Europe, because the reality of the postmodern, post-COVID world is that even more people are apprehensive about international and global lifestyles. What does media representation of Ukraine and Belarus say to people when Ukraine is associated with corruption and Belarus is associated with repressive authoritarianism? Because although these things are true to some extent, what is most interesting is that the media chooses to focus on these factors and angles on these countries and the perception that creates. We know there is clearly an agenda, there always is. And if you read between the lines coming at these media issues and what that means in the context of this podcast, which is about lifestyle, they are discouraging people from the kind of advantages that I am discussing here. That is what cheaper cost of living fundamentally means. Once again, it's that opportunity to remind you that geopolitics is incidental to the context of this lifestyle podcast. But what we're trying to do is reach an understanding of these subjects in order to benefit our lifestyle, our personal circumstances. The whole COVID crisis has reminded us how much of our fortunes are determined by how quickly we react when a paradigm shift occurs. And that is what is bringing a whole different aspect to this episode, is that a unique moment is now unfolding. And what I am working through here is revisiting a lot of the content we swept through broadly on the first podcast, which means I have to talk about business and I have to talk about dating before we get into some personal reflections on the experience of my trip last year, over a year ago now. But now, since this COVID situation changed my travel plans, it brings us all back to where it leaves us moving forward from here. The basic stuff that is ever is driven by technological trends, communication trends, and more broadly, these geopolitical trends remain the same. Your cost of living is reduced, your runway, so to speak, in startup terms, is vastly extended. You have access to skilled workers and spaces at a fraction of the cost, and the arbitrage you gain by that, as I've said, basic stuff. Being savvy about trends, being aware that the lag between various parts of Eastern Europe and global cultural trends and consumer trends is ever shortening, as consumerism still has huge headroom in these places where more efficient technologies are slowly bleeding in. But fundamentally, when faced with the business culture in the East, you will recognize what those born in Eastern Europe clearly already see, that it's still easier to make your money in the West and engage in full lifestyle arbitrage. But now, once again, there is a shifting political frame where you have to have an honest conversation about how stable parts of the United States will remain and what point it is safer to look at permanently relocating to Eastern Europe, which region is more likely to be under political pressure and civic dysfunction in the short to mid-term. I don't really see myself setting up a business in the East as my priority. There's easier money elsewhere. It's as simple as that. But you see again, there is a baseline set of circumstances that favour business in the West, and there's the COVID factor to consider, and that there's much that can be described about the great financial crisis that can add to our understanding of what a crisis does in terms of creating new opportunities. In this case of COVID, vast new opportunities arising from vast disruption to usual business, where those who have money are becoming more desperate to seek the availability of the types of products and services they rely on, and finding there's no one to meet that demand. The system is currently under too much stress. It is a unique situation to innovate. And I recognize this because it was in 2009 that my business took off, back in the last crisis, because I was already streamlined to using new technology, new tools that would take over in a post-crisis era. That's what's going to happen now. Now, I recognise that we must reflect on the scale of change that occurred after 9/11, and that despite the outcome, there is going to be a far greater response in terms of how, in the future, the risk posed by pandemics is confronted. That really belongs in the conclusion of this recording, where we can reflect on where this leaves us and how the whole picture looks when we start piecing it together. But, we said work from home and remote skills is clearly a huge factor. If you're location independent, I can't see that, other than those in travel niches, that those I know living that kind of location independent lifestyle have been compromised by the COVID crisis at all. But I did see those startup entrepreneurs and content creators pushing that lifestyle, beginning to level up to trading stocks, currency, Bitcoin of course, and looking at real estate investment in Eastern Europe, South Asia, South America, the three main hotspots for location independent living. Now, in times of uncertainty, real estate in developing markets becomes a gamble for those without solid knowledge. We will talk more about Georgia as compared to, say, Belarus. Georgia's open regulations make your general affairs much more straightforward, and how this question is considered in terms of the long-term stability of the region. But to conclude on the subject of business, I look at my situation and 100% of my income is coming from sources in the West, where I've positioned myself to receive income from investments I made, understanding how assets would move in the context of a modern economy reaching crisis. So I've been fortunate in that area. So now, when it comes to dating, in the first podcast I put my finger on the widespread dissatisfaction that was occurring amongst singles in the West. No one particularly seems to have benefited from the use of dating apps. It has created opportunities perhaps for the very most desirable people and for the less fortunate in the area of raw sexual appeal, but still leads to a general malaise that dating is becoming a data-driven churn, a consumerist experience where you're driven to shop for sexual partners based primarily on their sex appeal. And now this is a podcast about globalization. And as a global culture of dating apps grows, you begin to see the same pattern emerging in other countries. But the whole idea of this podcast is to leverage your international opportunities. And this, as you can see, is connected by the lifestyle offered, by a radically reduced cost of living. It's not expensive today, and you have more time to do it. Wherever you go, you are somewhat exotic, but this does lead me to another great story that brings so much dynamic context to the subject matter right across this podcast. That when I was stuck on my farm here in New Zealand through the mid-year and there was still lockdowns occurring, I was on Tinder because I was bored, and I noticed something in particular that I began matching with these beautiful, classy girls from Hong Kong mainly. Also wealthy Chinese girls, Singapore girls. And these were really gorgeous girls, and the sort of classy girls I like, intelligent but traditional, and I was so curious because I saw this trend right before my eyes. I was speaking with over half a dozen of these girls and began to explain what I saw to them, especially since you might remember what I told you about the scams I experienced in Ukraine, and we will talk more about the reality of having a more serious relationship with someone when you're living on the other side of the world. And these Chinese girls Some were stuck in New Zealand due to COVID, but most of them were still in Hong Kong. And at the time, I was connecting the political issues that we saw exploding in Belarus and also Thailand, which we will talk about. And here I was making this curious connection to these lovely Chinese girls, and I wanted to understand what was going on. And at first, I was convinced it was some kind of blockchain investment scam. You remember, I'm experienced with sophisticated catfish scams in Ukraine. And there was a reoccurring theme that many of these beautiful girls were making a lot of money trading Bitcoin and Chinese stocks based on their family connections. And that didn't feel like a scam, as these girls were often moody, they'd disagree with me about politics and other such matters, which is simply not really catfish behavior as you would expect from more common as what you'd expect from upper-class Chinese girls. Their expectations were very high, and the conclusion I was finally forced to make was that they found me physically attractive because I am white. This was mind-blowing for me, and such an interesting perspective on globalized dating, because for the first time I had attractive women from a wealthier situation than even I'm in being somewhat pushy in the suggestion I would fit in with their lifestyle in Hong Kong simply because they liked my aesthetic. Whereas in a place like Ukraine or Thailand, you know, that dynamic of course is completely reversed. And it's a great way for me not only to pass on a way for you to think about international dating, but also to start in on the next section of the podcast, crossing over from the broader lifestyle themes I've talked about to what I actually experienced in trying to set down my own path. For you to assume you bring tremendous benefits to someone you date in a developing country, think about how you would feel in a similar situation to what I was in with these Hong Kong girls, where they just assumed I wanted to compromise my lifestyle for the opportunities they offered. And of course it would be incredible to date a beautiful Hong Kong girl and trade on their stock tips they get through their family connections. But at the end of the day, you know, it's not really who I am. You know? You may be aware that what brought me back to Belarus was the woman that I was involved with there. And I was also on a sharp learning curve trying to perceive what the expectations of these women were. And you should know by now, these women have no reason to want to leave their lives behind. I have enough distance from the event now to be aware that it was foolish of me to expect a beautiful foreign girl to wait many months for me to return. And by the time I was on my way back to Belarus, it was quite clear to me that something was clearly wrong. She wasn't just not responding to my messages, but she had quite clearly blocked me on all channels. And so not only did I arrive back in Belarus with very little hope, but I also proceeded to get food poisoning. And now I remember it, I had the skin condition that I get reoccurring. It flared up so bad in Thailand because of the heat. And of course it doesn't help, you know, I had some problem with my phone. I couldn't pay for Tinder or any of the dating apps. What I'm starting to say here is that I was having a major reality check. My health wasn't good. I was pretty heartbroken that my girl just cut me off cold. And it was the reality check that I needed to remind me that that's life. Sometimes things don't go your way. Except here I was in another country where I didn't speak the language. But Belarus is really wonderful, and I was still able to meet some great girls. But even more so, I had a much deeper experience in Minsk, and once again it opens up doors to new ways of thinking. I started spending most of the day just walking around Minsk, listening to podcasts, and because of the atmosphere of the city being very austere, drab, dour, the Stalinist aesthetic of the white, beige, cream coloured tones everywhere, with the wide open green spaces, I began to get more absorbed into quite a deeper thought process and what I was really doing there in a much deeper sense. I'd already done a series of video diaries about minimalism leading up to when I left, and once again, picking up from the last Basewave podcast that I did, I was never able to get into a productive routine when I was traveling last year. I'd fallen for this girl who was the very first girl I had dated, the first time I even travelled in Eastern Europe, and very quickly as that escalated, I was forced to think about my finances long term and having a steady cash flow. So this was the whole theme of the last podcast. In the first podcast, it was about general themes and concepts, whereas in the second, we see how these things played out for me in reality. I met a great girl, and suddenly I was under increased income pressure to be in a position to support her. So that's where I left off in the last podcast. I returned to New Zealand to make some decisions about where I would go with my money, that the possibilities are all there for you in Eastern Europe, but it is, as I have said, 2 years on from that point, where all of my income comes from consolidating what I was already doing, although that has more to do with what happened with COVID. It was my intention to sell my farm, but when my girl cut me off, I was quickly forced to wake up to reality that you are not going to sleepwalk into great opportunities that exist in Eastern Europe without facing the same challenges that are presented to anyone wanting to play for the big prizes in life. And facing the core nature of these dilemmas started to inform my thinking on minimalist philosophy, existential philosophy. It went deeper than what I had been confronting, trying to get rid of, unnecessary junk. How much income we really need, all the way back around to core concepts on this podcast about cost of living, not just about physical clutter, but also clutter in your life created by the extra work and demand that you place on yourself to maintain your lifestyle, because there's that which you don't need and there's that which is much cheaper to afford in Eastern Europe. And then there's the secondary effects. The more you realize you don't need many of the things you rely on to cope with a demanding lifestyle in the West, where you're accustomed to all these little comforts. And this is where I did begin to feel some conflict, that the women I was meeting were not particularly motivated to leave their home countries, but there was an expectation foreign men would provide them with a better lifestyle than they already had, through consuming more products and services. And this was not something I was at ease with philosophically, that the lifestyle I perceived as conscientious was simple and relaxed and natural, enjoying an affordable lifestyle on my farm and spending summer in Eastern Europe, whereas many of the foreign girls from traditional and developing countries perceive conscientiousness as working your damn guts out to buy the biggest house, have lots of stuff, have lots of kids. Their concept of consumer capitalism was still very immature and undeveloped. A lot of the Russian girls, despite their traditional backgrounds, do feel very keenly they can buy their way to a better life if they meet a man who has the money to do that. And when I sensed that the understanding these women had of me and my farm was that I did not have the means to give them the Western consumer lifestyle as they saw it, and so what I was offering did not have the appeal that I thought it did. This is what I talked about in Barriers to Business. There simply isn't much understanding in Eastern Europe of trading stocks, property markets, Bitcoin, the most modern aspects of wealth creation, which of course the Hong Kong girls, who have been exposed to massive economic wealth creation in China, are completely aware of. Yeah, I didn't have to describe anything or explain anything about how to manage a portfolio to girls in Hong Kong and, wealthy Chinese girls. No way.
Just one thing.
So,
I'm gonna figure out.
I also prepared a series of short videos on the cities I visited between my stays in Minsk, where I travelled to Warsaw, Bucharest, and Tbilisi, and that's what it was. Because of some problem with the billing on my phone, I couldn't pay for Tinder. And I couldn't set my location before I arrived to get dates ready a week in advance for when I got there. So it was impossible to date. But I was, I was visiting new cities, so it lifted me out of my low mood and set me thinking deeper about what I was trying to do here. The minimalism isn't just about stuff. Oh yeah, it's about time. Not just robbing yourself of time as you work to pay for your expensive lifestyle, or all your money is sucked into your housing costs in the West, but the desperation we have to want to achieve so many things, like a closet full of shoes you never wear. How much do you really need to achieve in life to be happy? And it wasn't until I got to Bucharest, and I was just really enjoying the connection with the city. It's a great city to explore on foot, and some great parks, and I started to drink, and suddenly found myself very much reflecting on how I felt in my early 20s. They're living in a quirky apartment in a quirky urban centre, drinking on sunny days in the park and hanging out in the cafes. I mean, thinking about the kind of music or content I would be creating that was relevant. You know, I started to come face to face with the experience of peeling back everything that has happened in my life and seeing that underneath, the same dreams I had are still there. Oh! And whereas in the West we can't have that dream anymore. You can afford to be an artist and have a cute apartment in the city and drink in the park and hang out at cool cafes working on projects in a city like Bucharest and many others I've visited. You can have that life. You can live an authentic existence where you do as you please without the vigorous demands to feed the all-consuming mouth that seems to demand more and more just for you to stand still. This suddenly seemed to reconnect me with where my creativity and productivity could be realized. That being a creative artist is really something you live out. It is a lifestyle. It is an event. It's not something that simply flows when you're crushed under the pressure that comes with attaining achievement and paying your bills like you do in the West. If you can scrape $1,000 per month together, you can survive as an artist in Eastern Europe. Now, Warsaw had a lot of free museums and galleries, but like Minsk, it was flattened in the war. But while Minsk has a very distinct Stalinist vibe, Warsaw just felt like Auckland to me. Lots of glass towers, not much character, lots of attractive people, but much more of a sense I was back in the West. And so it was really Georgia I was looking forward to, because it has been steadily developing as a hotspot for nomads, and my expectations were already very high because the numbers look great. And as I mentioned, what is special about Georgia, and you'll find some of these aspects apply also to Estonia, which we will discuss also, is that in terms of immigration, property ownerships, tax, business dealings, work permits, Georgia has been radically deregulated to attract foreigners and tourists, investors, and so a flow-on effect has taken place. There already is a very vibrant intermingling of cultures going on. Muslim families, Russian tourists, European tourists, all mingling, yet the place is not overrun with tourists like many other European cities, but the layers to which it attracts are really something else. It's just the dense variety of what it offers. It's a great city to visit and experience, the ruins and the cheap and abundant food, the European chic of the cafes, galleries, restaurants, the club scene, all the European stuff that you like. And of course, Tbilisi is one of the few European cities untouched by World War II bombing. So it has these old wooden buildings everywhere, which give us this crazy Jack the Ripper 19th century type vibe. You got the Soviet vibe, and the more Eastern influences. It's just so cheap. You don't really even have to book an Airbnb in advance. They are abundantly cheap. Probably still not as cheap as Vietnam. And the heat does climb in summer, but I still found the heat better than obviously Southeast Asia or even Brisbane. Nor did I find the dating prospects brilliant. My Tinder actually ran out of people in the area. It was mainly other tourists, so I dated one local girl who was very nice, and a Filipino chick who was working in Dubai. It was pretty close. So I almost feel exhausted in underlying the benefits of Tbilisi. But it's centered around the lax regulations and how this played off against Minsk, which is not a place where you are going to find it easy to get yourself established long term, and this is not what you'd consider a stimulating environment. But I'm almost drawn to Minsk from the first moment I arrived there by the slightly sorrowful and down mood of the city, and I was already committed to returning to Minsk because my only other choice was to come home, and I'd already met another girl in Minsk and I was glad to see her again. But it was at this time when I had already begun drinking every day for the first time since I was back in school that I was inspired to start an anonymous YouTube channel talking about mental health and philosophical ideas. I was still spending each day walking, catching the bus to different parts of Minsk and walking around, drinking and listening to podcasts. I was connecting with some deeper ideas that made me feel connected to Minsk as a city. The girls are obviously the main attraction in the Soviet atmosphere and history, but now I feel very tied to the city because of my emotional experiences there. And yet we have on the other hand Tbilisi in Georgia that presents itself as a sensational base camp with many utilitarian aspects for someone with various interests all over Eastern Europe and reaching into the Middle East and back towards Asia. The aspect about Georgia as an international data is that their immigration control regulations are lax across the board for all nations. You can bring your partner for as long as you like as well, no matter where they're from. But it must be said in consideration that the reason this podcast was so delayed was the uncertainty 2020 is presented, and that is, in this context, the full military conflict taking place between Armenia and Azerbaijan, only a few hours drive from Georgia. Once again, much like the election issues in Belarus, we are seeing the region stabilize. And how wise is it to consider relocating from one unstable region to another? There are far-reaching historical understandings that encapsulate the strategic management of the area, the region, beyond what we see as the animosity between Berlin and Moscow, which seems to characterize the unrest in Belarus. That a liberalizing agenda from the West in Belarus puts pressure on Putin's allies. So my readings on the Great Game and the pivot of history as terms for strategic management of Eastern European power, it is not realistic to believe that there won't continue